At a desk in the School of Medicine at Stony Brook University, sometime in the middle years of the last decade, a critical care physician named Sam Parnia was writing something down. The window behind him looked out over a campus, settling into late afternoon, the light shifting across the courtyard below, the buildings going quiet at the edges. On the desk in front of him were draft protocols, institutional review forms, correspondence with colleagues in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and a legal pad on which he had been working through, clause by clause, the formal statement of a scientific hypothesis. The hypothesis, as he was writing it, was precise. It was not large. It was not unusual in its grammar or its structure. Not from the outside. It looked like a hypothesis. It read like a hypothesis. It read like a hypothesis. What it proposed to test, however, that had taken years of careful, incremental work to arrive at. The question Parnia was building toward was whether a person lying clinically dead on a hospital bed during cardiac resuscitation could accurately perceive and later report specific visual information placed in their physical environment at a location their body could not possibly access from any ordinary vantage point. Not whether people said they had unusual experiences during cardiac arrest. Not whether those experiences felt meaningful to the people who had them. The question was narrower and more formal and built on a specific observation he had been gathering and examining since the late 1990s, when he was working at a hospital in Southampton, England, and patients who had been resuscitated began telling him in careful and unprompted language that they had looked down on their own resuscitations from somewhere above. Those early accounts at Southampton General Hospital were the foundation everything else was built on. The hospital corridors there were polished and faintly reflective under fluorescent light. The clinical spaces arranged in the particular institutional geometry of a large National Health Service facility, and Parnia had moved through them in the early 2000s, collecting patient reports with the methodical patience of someone who had decided that the proper scientific response to recurring anomalous testimony was not to dismiss it and not to accept it, but to design a test for it. The accounts he gathered were not dramatic in the way one might expect. Patients described position, personnel, equipment layout. They reported hearing voices and sounds. They described a perspective from above the bed that corresponded with varying degrees of specificity to what a person hovering near the ceiling would have been able to see. The accounts were consistent across patients who had no contact with each other, and consistent in ways that would have been difficult to attribute simply to cultural expectation or prior knowledge about what near-death experiences were supposed to contain. What Parnia recognized in those accounts was not proof of anything. He was precise about that from the beginning. What he recognized was a scientific gap, a space between what was being reported and what the available research methods had so far been equipped to test. Witness accounts, however consistent and however numerous, could not settle an empirical question about perception. The testimony existed. The question of what it documented remained open. And the way to begin narrowing that question, he concluded, was to introduce something into the physical environment that would serve as a target, a specific unambiguous object placed in a location accessible only from the out-of-body vantage point the patients described, so that accurate identification could function as a controlled, falsifiable test. The hypothesis, in its finished form, was elegant in the way that well-designed experimental questions sometimes are. If out-of-body experiences during cardiac arrest involved genuine perceptual access to the physical environment, and if that perceptual access was occurring from an elevated position near the ceiling, as patients consistently described, then a patient having such an experience should be able to identify an image placed on a shelf, mounted high enough that no one in the room, not the patient on the bed, not the medical staff at the bedside, could see it from any normal standing or lying position. If such an identification occurred, it would be evidence, controlled, documented, verifiable, of something that no current model of consciousness during cardiac arrest could account for. If such an identification did not occur, that too would be information. The study was designed to produce findings either way. What made this approach scientifically unusual was not the ambition of the question, but the patience required to get it properly into a hospital setting. Parnia had spent long enough in clinical research to understand that the distance between a hypothesis on a legal pad and a rigorously controlled prospective study across multiple hospitals was measured not in intellectual steps, but in institutional ones. There were ethics boards in multiple countries. There were hospital administrators. There were logistics committees, recruitment protocols, informed consent procedures, data management frameworks, and coordination requirements that would take years to satisfy. The study, as it was eventually designed, would need to operate inside the actual workflow of cardiac resuscitation medicine in real hospitals during real cardiac arrest events, which was to say, in conditions that were by definition uncontrolled, variable, and impossible to predict. The study that Parnia eventually designed was called AWARE. The acronym stood for Awareness During Resuscitation, and the stated scientific objectives were, in the language of the eventual published paper, both broader and narrower than the popular understanding of near-death experience research might suggest. The broader objective was to prospectively measure the full range of mental and perceptual experiences reported by patients who had survived cardiac arrest, not just out-of-body experiences, but any form of awareness, perception, memory, or subjective content that patients reported having during the period when they were clinically dead and actively being resuscitated. The narrower objective was to test whether any of those patients could identify the overhead targets, to provide the first prospective, controlled empirical assessment of the specific claim that out-of-body experiences involved genuine visual access to the environment from a non-bodily position. The scope of the study, as it was eventually approved and launched, was considerable. 15 hospitals agreed to participate. Institutions in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria, spread across 2 continents and operating under different national research frameworks, different institutional cultures, and different resuscitation protocols. Coordinating a prospective research study of this kind across 15 hospitals required a level of administrative and scientific infrastructure that was, in the world of consciousness research, genuinely unusual. Most research on near-death experiences at the time was retrospective, researchers finding and interviewing patients after the fact, often years later, without any prospective structure and without any experimental design that could generate verifiable findings. AWARE was different. It enrolled patients prospectively, established defined measurement instruments in advance, and installed physical experimental apparatus in real clinical spaces in advance of the events it was designed to capture. The Stony Brook desk where Parnia worked was covered, in those preparatory years, not only with the experimental hypothesis, but with the correspondence that a 15-hospital study required. There were letters to institutional review boards and their counterparts in the National Health Service. There were site-specific protocols for each participating hospital, adapted to the particular layout of each cardiac arrest bay. There were discussions about target selection, about what kinds of images would be sufficiently distinctive and unambiguous that any accurate patient description could not be attributed to chance, or to guessing, or to the vague pattern matching that retrospective accounts might allow. And there were conference calls, voices crossing time zones, a researcher in New York speaking with colleagues in Southampton and in Vienna, the connection imperfect at the edges, but the conversation proceeding with the methodical clarity of people trying to agree on every element of a test that would have to run reliably for years inside one of the most chaotic clinical environments in medicine. Those calls were practical in their content. There were specific questions to settle. What hospitals would participate? Which cardiac arrest bays in those hospitals would receive the overhead shelf installations? What images would be selected? How would the shelves be mounted? And at what angle, to guarantee that the target surface was visible only from directly above? How would staff compliance with the installation protocols be monitored over time? How would the follow-up interviews with survivors be conducted, and on what timeline after discharge? How would patient reports be coded and compared against documented clinical observations? Every element of the study design was discussed, revised, and agreed on before the first shelf went up in the first cardiac arrest bay. This is what a prospective study requires: the hypothesis fixed in advance, the measurement instruments specified in advance, the apparatus installed in advance, so that the findings, whatever they turned out to be, could not be shaped after the fact by the expectations of the people conducting the study. What made the study's underlying question distinctive within the broader landscape of clinical research was not that it was unscientific. The methodology was constructed with the same care that any peer-reviewed clinical investigation demands. What made the question distinctive was what it was asking the scientific method to do. The AWARE study was, in its formal structure, a standard prospective observational study with a controlled perceptual test embedded inside it. In its conceptual structure, it was asking whether something that conventional neuroscience held to be impossible, coherent, accurate, first-person perceptual experience during a period of confirmed cerebral inactivity was in fact occurring. Parnia was not claiming in advance that it was. He was asking, and the asking took the form of a physical shelf mounted near the ceiling of a hospital cardiac arrest bay, with an image placed face up on its surface, waiting. Parnia's early work at Southampton had been exploratory in its design, gathering, interviewing, cataloging. The accounts he had collected there had enough internal consistency to warrant a more formal investigation, and their consistency with accounts from other patient populations, in other hospitals, in other countries, studied by other researchers over several decades, added weight to the case for a controlled prospective study, rather than another round of retrospective testimony collection. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, had published a large prospective study of near-death experiences in cardiac arrest patients in The Lancet in 2001, establishing a precedent for taking these accounts seriously within the peer-reviewed clinical literature and providing a methodological foundation that Parnia's work at Southampton had been building on. The field was not without its serious researchers, but the specific question of veridical, out-of-body perception, the question of whether patients could actually see the things they said they saw from above, had not, before AWARE, been subjected to a prospective controlled test at scale. The scale of AWARE was part of what made it significant. A single hospital study might produce findings that were interesting but limited. A 15-hospital study conducted across multiple countries, subject to formal peer review, and published in the official journal of the European Resuscitation Council, would produce findings that were difficult to set aside without engaging seriously with the methodology. This was a deliberate choice. Parnia was not building a study for people who were already persuaded that near-death experiences involved genuine non-bodily perception. He was building a study designed to produce findings robust enough to place the question inside the mainstream clinical literature, where it could be evaluated on the same evidentiary terms as any other investigation of a poorly understood medical phenomenon. The journal in which the AWARE findings were eventually published, Resuscitation, the official publication of the European Resuscitation Council, was not a fringe publication. It was a clinical journal with a distinguished peer review process and a readership of resuscitation physicians and researchers who were accustomed to evaluating controlled prospective studies on the basis of methodology, sample size, statistical approach, and the internal consistency of the findings. It was not a journal that was in the habit of publishing studies about near-death experiences. When the AWARE paper appeared there in October 2014, its presence in that specific clinical context was itself a marker of what the study had set out to do, not to address believers or skeptics in the cultural conversation about near-death experiences, but to place a carefully constructed scientific question inside the literature where cardiac arrest medicine lives. The paper was dense. It ran across many columns of close text. It included enrollment figures, survival rates, interview completion rates, and the results of the various psychological assessment instruments that had been used to classify patient reports. It discussed the installation history of the overhead targets across the participating hospitals, including the difficulties that had arisen in maintaining consistent target presence over the study period. It reported the primary findings regarding patient awareness during resuscitation, and it included, with careful and deliberate qualification, the account of the single patient whose reported experience during cardiac arrest had been partially corroborated against independent clinical observations, the account that would become, for most people who discussed the AWARE study, the detail that defined it. In October 2014, that paper was sitting on library tables in medical schools and research institutions across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe. It was in clinical databases. It was being read and discussed and disputed, and in some corners of the resuscitation medicine community, noted with something between interest and uncertainty. The journal it appeared in was a pale-covered publication, with dense columns of text, not a dramatic object, not an obviously significant-looking thing from the outside. Inside its pages, at the point where the AWARE paper began, the findings of a study that had taken the better part of a decade to design, fund, gain approval for, install, operate, and complete were laid out in the measured, methodical language of peer-reviewed clinical science. The study had begun with a question. A physician at a desk in Southampton in the early 2000s, listening to patients describe what they said they had seen while they were clinically dead, and concluding that the accounts were consistent enough and specific enough and anomalous enough from the perspective of conventional neuroscience that the question they raised deserved something more than dismissal and something more precise than endorsement. It had traveled from that desk to a much larger desk at Stony Brook, to conference calls across time zones, to ethics boards on 2 continents, to 15 hospitals, to hundreds of cardiac arrest bays, to elevated shelves mounted at precise angles near hospital ceilings, to follow-up interview rooms where surviving patients were asked, quietly and carefully, what they remembered. And then it had traveled into print. What the study had built, across all of those years and all of that institutional effort, was a machine for asking a specific question clearly and recording the answer, whatever the answer was. That machine had been built from protocols and approval forms and shelf brackets and printed images and interview schedules and the cooperation of clinical staff in hospitals across 3 countries. It had been built by researchers who believed that the question deserved the discipline of a controlled experiment rather than the indefinite accumulation of informal testimony. And it had been built small enough in its central hypothesis to be answerable in principle: one image, one shelf, one patient looking down from above, one accurate identification, documented and verified. That was all the hypothesis required. That was the specific and careful shape of the question Sam Parnia had written down on a legal pad in Stony Brook, watching the campus go quiet outside his window, in the years before the first shelf went up in the first cardiac arrest bay. The Aware paper lay open on library tables in October 2014 in the way that all clinical papers eventually lie open, quietly, in the ordinary physical form of a journal publication. In a world of journal publications, its dense columns of text available to anyone who knew to look for them in a publication that had never before contained anything quite like this. The resuscitation medicine community was not, as a community, accustomed to receiving this kind of question in its peer-reviewed literature. The question of whether consciousness persisted in any coherent perceptual form during confirmed cardiac arrest was not a question that conventional resuscitation medicine had a place for, not because the community was indifferent to consciousness, but because the machinery of the field was aimed at restoring circulation and oxygenation and survival, and the experiential reports of the people who had been through that process were, from a clinical standpoint, peripheral to the medical problem the field was designed to solve. What Aware had done was to ask that peripheral question with the tools of the central discipline: prospective enrollment, controlled measurement, peer review, institutional coordination, published findings. It had asked, in the language the field recognized, a question the field had not previously had the apparatus to receive. Whether the apparatus had produced a definitive answer was, as of October 2014, a separate matter. The apparatus had produced findings. The findings were in print, and anyone who opened the journal to the right page in a library or a clinical office or a hospital research room in the autumn of 2014 would find themselves at the beginning of a question that the study had made more precise than it had been before, and that was still, clearly, openly, by the study's own accounting, waiting for its final answer. The image of that journal, lying open in October 2014 to the page where the Aware paper began, is a quiet one, a pale cover, dense text, the measured language of people who had spent years building something careful, an investigation that had asked one of the oldest questions medicine has ever encountered: what happens to perception during clinical death, and had asked it with shelf brackets and follow-up interviews and a prospective enrollment of more than 2,000 cardiac arrest events across 15 hospitals, 2 continents. The findings were there. The question, as of the paper's conclusion, had been given better tools and better data than it had held before. It was still, as the paper itself was honest enough to acknowledge, open, and there was, somewhere in the recorded particulars of the Aware study's single most closely examined case, something that had arrived exactly where the study's central hypothesis could not reach it, a detail that the methodology had been built to test, appearing in the one room where the test had not been installed. That unresolved particular was sitting in the paper, in print, in October 2014, the way that open scientific questions tend to sit, patient, documented, waiting. The study had not begun with certainty. It had begun with attention, the specific, careful, unhurried attention of a physician who had listened to enough patients describe enough similar things in enough similar terms to conclude that the proper response was not interpretation, but investigation. That attention had been organized over many years and across many institutions into something large enough and rigorous enough to place itself inside the peer-reviewed clinical literature and hold its ground there. And it had produced, among its findings, the record of one patient's account of looking down on his own resuscitation from a position near the ceiling of a room where no target shelf had been installed, where the study's central test could not have been run, which was, in the end, perhaps the most precise summary of what the AWARE study had achieved. It had built the most careful test the question had ever been given, and the most compelling piece of evidence in its data set had arrived just outside the boundary of what the test could measure. The paper recorded that fact without drama. It was a scientific observation. It was what the study had found. And in the autumn of 2014, it was sitting in print in a clinical journal, in a world that was still, quietly, trying to decide what to make of it. The first shelf went up in a working hospital room, not a laboratory, not a simulation, a room that had resuscitations in it, where the equipment had been cleared to one wall to make space, and where the ceiling was close enough to the floor that a person standing in the doorway could take in the whole geometry of the place in a single glance. The unit was mounted near the ceiling with its surface angled upward, facing not toward the room, but toward the fluorescent panels above it, toward the ceiling tiles, toward whatever might be above the ceiling tiles. A researcher had calculated the angles in advance. The shelf was positioned to defeat every normal sight line in the room. The logic of the target system began with a constraint. The constraint was this: anyone who had reported an out-of-body experience during cardiac arrest had reported it from above. The accounts, accumulated over decades from hospitals in multiple countries, described the same general geometry again and again: a perspective near the ceiling, looking down at the resuscitation team, looking down at the body on the bed, looking down at the room as a whole, from a vantage point no one lying on the bed and no one standing beside it could occupy. The accounts were consistent about direction. They described the world from above. The experimental design took that consistency seriously. If the accounts were describing genuine perceptual access to the environment from an elevated perspective, then a target visible only from that elevated perspective, visible only from above, and visible from every other angle in the room, would either be seen or it would not. That was the test. That was what the shelves were built to do. Each unit was constructed to a specification developed by the research team and made from materials available to any hospital's maintenance and facilities department. The shelf surface itself was unremarkable, a flat panel, angled and mounted, the kind of practical object that a hospital room accumulates without anyone particularly noticing it. What made it significant was its orientation, face up, angled toward the ceiling. Every sightline from the floor of the room, whether from a standing position at the bedside or from a lying position on the bed itself, met the underside of the shelf rather than its surface. The image on the shelf was hidden by the geometry of the unit, not by any covering or obstruction. Anyone looking at the shelf from below saw only the underside of the panel. The image on the surface above was present in the room, accessible in principle and entirely invisible in practice to anyone in the room who was not positioned directly above it. Researchers working through the sightline calculations confirmed the principle from multiple positions. A resuscitation team gathered around a patient's bed would include people standing at the patient's head, at the sides, and at the foot. Nurses positioning themselves for compressions would be close to the patient and leaning forward, their line of vision directed downward toward the patient rather than upward toward the ceiling. A physician calling a rhythm and preparing defibrillation would be positioned beside the bed, their attention on the monitor and the team. None of these positions, no matter how carefully the person in them tried to look upward at the shelf, would reveal its surface. The angle of the unit closed off the view from every position that a person standing or working in the room could occupy. Only a perspective at ceiling height, looking downward, would place the image within view. The images chosen for placement were not subtle. Subtlety would have complicated interpretation. If a patient reported seeing something vague, a shape, a color, an impression on a shelf that held a vague or complex image, the match would be difficult to assess. The research team wanted images that were immediately identifiable, resistant to coincidental description, and easy to score against a patient's account without ambiguity. Bold geometric shapes were among the selections. Animals with clear silhouettes were chosen, shapes that a person could name accurately or inaccurately without any difficulty deciding which was which. Culturally familiar symbols and objects that carried strong visual identity were included. The images were printed in high contrast with clean edges and strong colors that would hold up under the fluorescent lighting of a hospital resuscitation bay and remain immediately legible to anyone looking at them from any angle at which they were visible. The reasoning behind the image selection was as careful as the reasoning behind the shelf design. A patient who reported seeing an animal on a shelf near the ceiling and correctly identified the species of that animal had produced a specific, verifiable claim.
The target either matched the description or it did not.
A patient who reported seeing a geometric shape and named the shape either correctly or incorrectly. There was no range of partial credit for which a clever account might earn half marks. The images were chosen to generate clear, unambiguous outcomes, a match or the absence of a match, so that any positive result could be read without dispute, and any negative result could be recorded without the complication of wondering whether a partial description might have been close enough. The system was designed for clarity from the moment the images were selected to the moment any patient account was assessed against them. In a cardiac arrest bay in the United Kingdom, one of the first installations took place during a period when the ward was between emergencies and a maintenance worker had been given access to the room to carry out the mounting work. The room was quiet in the way that hospital rooms are quiet between their busiest moments, the equipment present and waiting, the bed remade and centered, the crash cart positioned where it would be needed. The shelf went up at the calculated angle. A bracket fixed it to the wall near the ceiling. The surface of the shelf, once mounted, was level and stable, the kind of surface on which a printed image would sit without sliding or shifting. The image was placed face up. The room returned to its ordinary arrangement. Nothing in the room looked different from the doorway. Nothing in the room looked different from the bedside. The shelf was there, near the ceiling, holding its image in a stillness that the room around it did not particularly acknowledge. A researcher verifying the installation stood at the bedside, at the head of the bed, at the foot of the bed, and beside the crash cart. From each position, the underside of the shelf was visible. From none of the positions was the surface visible. The image on the shelf was confirmed present and confirmed concealed. The installation was recorded in the study's logistical records. The room went back on the ward roster. Resuscitations that took place in that room from that point forward were occurring in a room where the target was present, where any patient who reported a genuine elevated perspective during their resuscitation was in principle in a position to describe what the shelf held. The target was a bright shape. It waited on its shelf in the particular stillness of something placed in order to be found by specific means, and left undisturbed against the possibility that those means would be exercised. Weeks passed. The room was used. Emergencies occurred in it. The crash cart was wheeled into position and wheeled back. The equipment was used and reset. The bed was cleaned and prepared again. The shelf held its image through all of it, unchanged, facing the ceiling, occupying the one angle in the room from which it would have been visible to whatever the study was designed to detect. Maintaining the installation across one hospital was a manageable problem. Maintaining it across 15 hospitals spread across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria over a period of several years turned out to be something else. The research team acknowledged this plainly in the findings they eventually published. Hospital environments are not stable. Wards are reorganized. Furniture is moved. Equipment is repositioned to accommodate new protocols or new devices. Staff turnover and the staff who join a ward after a study installation has been made do not always know what the installation is or why it matters that it remain exactly as it was placed. A maintenance worker assigned to rearrange a resuscitation bay might move a shelf. A nurse who needed more ceiling clearance for a new piece of monitoring equipment might have the shelf taken down without knowing it was part of a research protocol. A facilities manager overseeing a ward renovation would have no particular reason to preserve a ceiling-mounted unit that was not part of the standard room specification. The challenge was not negligence, and it was not indifference. It was the ordinary reality of a working hospital environment, applied to a research protocol that required precise physical conditions to persist over years rather than over days or weeks. The conditions necessary for the target system to function, shelf present, image correctly placed and face up, sightlines confirmed, unobstructed, required repeated verification, and repeated verification required ward staff to understand and remember the protocol at the level of practical routine. Where that understanding held, the installations held. Where staff turnover created gaps in institutional memory of the study's requirements, the installations became vulnerable. An image placed face down by someone who straightened a shelf without knowing why it faced upward. A shelf removed because a ward reorganization needed the wall space for something else. A target replaced with the wrong image when the original was damaged, and a replacement was sourced from somewhere other than the research team's approved supply. By the time the study's findings were documented, targets had been successfully installed and maintained in only approximately 1/3 of the cardiac arrest zones across the participating hospitals. The remaining zones, the majority of the designated cardiac arrest areas across the 15 institutions, had either never received a target installation or had lost their target to the practical pressures of the hospital environment before the study concluded. A cardiac arrest that occurred in one of those rooms generated a patient who might be interviewed afterward, might be eligible for assessment, might report an out-of-body experience with an elevated perspective, might describe looking down at the room from near the ceiling, and would have been looking down, if the account were accurate, at a room that held no target at all. The visual perception test the study was designed to perform could only theoretically have been performed in rooms where the target system was operational. Cardiac arrests distributed themselves without reference to which rooms held targets. The problem was visible in advance. The research team had known that maintaining consistent physical conditions across 15 hospitals over multiple years would be difficult. The published findings acknowledged the maintenance challenge directly, framing it not as an oversight, but as one of the fundamental operational difficulties of conducting prospective near-death experience research in real clinical environments rather than in controlled laboratory settings. A laboratory can maintain a physical installation indefinitely and verify its condition at any moment. A working hospital ward cannot offer the same guarantee. The rooms are in continuous use. The conditions that make a room suitable for a research installation coexist with the conditions that make the room necessary for emergency clinical care, and when those two sets of requirements conflict, emergency clinical care takes precedence. The research protocol adapts or waits or loses the installation and records the loss and continues. What the 1/3 figure meant, in practical terms, was that the study's primary visual perception test, the test that had organized the construction of the target shelves, the selection of the images, the calculation of the sight lines, was available across a minority of the enrolled cardiac arrest locations. The rest of the locations were participating in the study's broader investigation of conscious awareness during cardiac arrest, contributing to the interview data, contributing to the follow-up assessment records, but not providing the physical conditions under which the image identification component of the study could function. The targets that were present and correctly installed were waiting in 1/3 of the designated rooms. The 2/3 of rooms without operational targets were waiting too, in a different sense, for resuscitations to occur in them, for patients to survive them, for interviews to be conducted and accounts to be collected, but not for the specific visual confirmation the shelf system was built to provide. A ward coordinator managing one of the UK participating hospitals kept a handwritten checklist through part of the study period. The checklist had a column for each target installation in the hospital's designated cardiac arrest zones and rows for periodic verification rounds. Some columns held unbroken sequences of check marks, a target present and confirmed at each verification date, the installation stable, the image correctly oriented, the sight lines intact. Other columns showed gaps, a check mark followed by a blank, followed by a note in the margin, shelf relocated during ward renovation, target replaced incorrectly, image found face down and corrected. The physical record of the installations was a document of effort and attention applied against the ordinary entropy of a busy hospital environment. The check marks and the blank spaces mapped the difference between the conditions the study needed and the conditions the study had. The image that occupied one of the longest maintained installations in the study held its position through multiple resuscitations in the room below it. The room was a standard cardiac arrest bay in a hospital that had committed fully to the protocol and had assigned a specific member of staff to oversee target maintenance as part of their role. The image was a bold animal shape, immediately identifiable, strongly contrasted, the kind of image that a person could name without hesitation. It sat on its shelf through the ordinary rhythm of the ward. The room was cleaned around it. The equipment in the room was checked and reset, and used and reset again. The image held its position, face up, invisible from the floor, present in the room in the particular way that things placed to be found are present, waiting in a very specific kind of stillness that is different from the stillness of things that are simply there. The view from ceiling height, looking down into such a room, would have been the view the experimental design was built around. The bed directly below, the crash cart positioned to one side, the monitor at the head of the bed, the door slightly ajar, the corridor beyond it, showing the edges of the ordinary clinical world outside the resuscitation bay. The image on the shelf would have been in view, bright against the shelf's surface, the colors holding clearly in the fluorescent light, the shape immediately readable from above. The geometry of the room, from that angle, would have been a geometry of attention directed downward, every object in the room organized around the bed, around the patient, around the activity of resuscitation, visible in its arrangement from a position that no member of the team standing in the room could occupy. That angle, ceiling height, looking down, was the angle the study was designed to investigate. Not metaphorically, not as a general inquiry into elevated perspectives. Literally, if a person reporting a genuine out-of-body experience during cardiac arrest was genuinely occupying a position at ceiling height in the room where their resuscitation was occurring, they would have been looking at that image. Whether they reported the image afterward, whether their account matched what the shelf held, whether the match could be confirmed against the independently maintained records of what each shelf contained at the time of each enrolled cardiac arrest. That sequence was the test. The test required the shelf to be there. The shelf was there, in 1/3 of the rooms, through the years the study ran. Outside those rooms, in the cardiac arrest bays where no shelf had been installed, or where the installation had been lost to the practical pressures of the ward environment, the study continued in a different register. Patients were resuscitated, survivors were identified and enrolled. Follow-up interviews were scheduled and conducted. Accounts were collected, accounts of awareness, of perception, of looking down at the room from above, of the room's layout and the positions of the people in it. Those accounts were recorded and assessed. They contributed to the study's broader investigation of conscious experience during cardiac arrest. But they were accounts collected from rooms without targets, and they could not be checked against any physical object that only an elevated perspective could have seen. The study held both kinds of data simultaneously, the data from rooms with operational targets and the data from rooms without them, and the relationship between the two categories was one of the fundamental features of its design. The rooms with targets were the rooms where the primary visual perception hypothesis could be tested. The rooms without targets were rooms where the study could collect accounts and gather information about the range and characteristics of conscious experience during cardiac arrest, but could not generate the specific evidence the image identification component required. Both categories were enrolled. Both categories were interviewed. The distinction between them mattered only at the moment of assessment, when an account of an elevated perspective could either be checked against a target or noted as occurring in a room where checking was not possible. A printed image resting on a shelf at ceiling height in a hospital in New York held its position through a period of months in which no cardiac arrest occurred in that room, while a target was installed and a patient survived and reported an elevated perspective. The image was bright. The colors were clear under the ceiling light. The shape was readable. The shelf was stable, correctly angled, the sight lines confirmed intact. At the last verification round, the room was active. It was used, cleaned, reset, used again, and the shelf was a part of the room's geometry that the room's ordinary activity moved around without disturbing. The image waited in the way that things placed to be found always wait, holding their position, not because they are attended to, but because they are simply there, present, unchanged, occupying the specific angle at which they could be found by the specific means the study was designed to test. Across the 3 countries where the study operated, the target installations in their working state represented a distributed system of visual tests, each one identical in principle, and each one embedded in a real clinical environment where its presence was subordinate to the practical demands of the ward. The system held where the ward circumstances permitted it to hold. It was lost where the ward circumstances worked against it. The research team recorded both outcomes and continued. The shelves that survived intact were still there at ceiling height, in their rooms, still facing upward, still holding their images in the particular stillness of objects that exist to be found. The shelves that had been moved or removed had left rooms without targets. Rooms where the study was still watching, but the specific visual test was no longer available. By the time a cardiac arrest bay in one of the participating hospitals had cleared its most recent resuscitation, the team dispersed, the patient moved, the equipment reset, the room quiet again in the minutes after a clinical event had concluded. The shelf above the room held its image in the same position it had occupied through all of it. The bright shape on the surface faced upward. The room below it was returning to its ordinary clinical stillness. The crash cart was back in position. The monitor was dark. The bed had been straightened. No one remaining in the room could see the image on the shelf. No one standing at the bedside or sitting at the monitor station or passing through the doorway had a sight line that reached the shelf's surface. The image was present in the room. The image was invisible in the room. Whether anyone had seen it, from any perspective, during the resuscitation that had just concluded, that question sat in the room, alongside the quiet and the reset equipment and the bed remade for the next patient. And it sat there without an answer, and the room around it did not particularly require one. The shelf held its image. The room returned to itself. The ward outside continued. The question of what anyone in that room had seen from above. During the minutes when the resuscitation was active and the team was gathered around the bed, remained exactly as open as it had been before the resuscitation began, available to be answered only by an account collected days later in a follow-up interview room that might describe what the shelf held, or might describe the room without reaching the ceiling, or might describe nothing at all from the resuscitation period, the clinical event leaving no memory that could be reported or verified or checked against anything. The shelf did not know which of those outcomes would come. It simply held its image in the quiet above the room, waiting in the way that the study had been designed to make it wait, precisely, patiently, at the one angle in the room from which it could be seen. On the printed page, in the formal language of clinical research, cardiac arrest is defined as the sudden cessation of effective cardiac mechanical activity, resulting in the absence of a detectable pulse, the loss of consciousness, and the cessation of normal breathing. That definition is precise and compact. It fits on a single line of a research enrollment form, which is where it appeared repeatedly across the 15 hospitals participating in the AWARE study, a line on a form that determined whether a particular clinical event qualified for inclusion in the investigation. The definition names what happened in the room. It does not describe the room itself, or the machines in it, or what the monitors showed in the seconds immediately before that line on a form became the applicable description. The electroencephalogram records electrical activity at the surface of the brain. It does not interpret that activity. It simply draws it, jagged, irregular lines moving across the paper or screen in real time, each oscillation a measurable correlate of something happening in the cortex, a continuous record of a brain doing what brains do. In studies examining the neurophysiology of cardiac arrest, researchers had documented what those lines do in the seconds after effective cardiac circulation stops. The oscillations continue briefly, then become slower and less regular, then flatten. The timeline, measured against the moment of cardiac arrest onset, runs to approximately 10 to 20 seconds. Within that window, the cortical electrical signature of consciousness, by the most common definition of what that signature represents, is no longer measurable. The line on the paper goes wide and still. What the AWARE study was designed to investigate was what, if anything, the patients were experiencing inside those seconds and in the extended interval that followed, and whether any part of what they reported could be checked against independently verifiable facts. That question, framed in clinical terms, is a strange one to sit with. It is not strange in the way of a poorly designed study or an implausible hypothesis. It is strange in the quieter sense that it required researchers to take seriously, as a scientific proposition worth testing, the reports of people who said they had perceived their environment while their cortical electrical activity was, by the standard measures available, not present. The study did not presuppose that those reports were accurate. It was designed precisely to test whether they were. That is the difference between an investigation and a belief. The investigation builds a test, installs it in the room, and waits. The distinction the AWARE study operated within, between clinical death and biological death, is worth holding clearly, because it is the clinical distinction that made the research population coherent as a scientific category. Clinical death in resuscitation medicine describes the cessation of circulatory and respiratory function that is potentially reversible through intervention. The heart has stopped, breathing has stopped, but the process of irreversible cellular deterioration has not yet progressed beyond the point where restoration of circulation could allow meaningful recovery. Biological death, by contrast, describes the state past that boundary, the condition in which restoration of circulation cannot prevent the cellular damage already done from becoming permanent. The AWARE study enrolled patients in the window of clinical death. All of them were in active resuscitation at the time of enrollment. Some of them survived to be interviewed afterward. Their survival defined them as having been, by the clinical standard, on the recoverable side of that boundary for the duration of their resuscitation, and what they had experienced or reported experiencing during that interval was what the researchers wanted to understand. A resuscitation team working a cardiac arrest follows a protocol. The protocol is not instinctive, though it becomes deeply familiar through training and repetition, and the familiarity can give it something of the quality of instinct. The steps arrive in the right order without requiring deliberate retrieval, because they have been rehearsed until they are embedded. The AWARE study enrolled patients at hospitals following the Advanced Cardiac Life Support Guidelines, published by the American Heart Association and the European Resuscitation Council, the standard frameworks governing resuscitation practice in the United States and Europe during the study period. That consistency was not incidental to the study's design. It meant that the clinical environment in which patients' cardiac arrests were managed, the sequence of interventions, the rhythm checks, the defibrillation protocols, the pharmacological approaches, was broadly standardized across sites, providing a common clinical backdrop against which any individual patient report could be interpreted. If a patient in Southampton and a patient in New York described similar experiences during resuscitation, the similarity could be examined against a known and consistent set of clinical events, rather than against entirely idiosyncratic local practices. The protocols themselves are systematic. The team works through a structured sequence, high-quality chest compressions, to maintain some degree of circulatory function, airway management, rhythm analysis, defibrillation where the cardiac rhythm permits it, intravenous or intraosseous access, and pharmacological intervention, and the continuing cycle of compression and reassessment. Each step has a timing and a logic. The crash cart holds the equipment in a fixed and known arrangement. The roles within the team are assigned. The verbal communication follows conventions that allow fast and accurate transfer of information under conditions of significant physiological urgency. What the team does in a cardiac arrest bay is work a problem through a procedure that has been designed to give the procedure the best possible chance of succeeding. It is, in its own way, a kind of careful attention, concentrated, rehearsed, responsive, and applied. The AWARE study enrolled a total of 2,060 cardiac arrest events across its participating institutions over the years. The study was active. Each of those events was a resuscitation, a clinical team working through the protocol in one of the designated cardiac arrest bays, the monitors running, the equipment in use, the documented record of the event being generated in real time by the medical team, 2,060 times across 15 hospitals in the United States and the United Kingdom and Austria. The clinical conditions that defined the study's enrollment criteria were present, and in each of those rooms, on the ceiling or near it, or in some cases not there at all, due to the installation challenges the study encountered, a shelf either was or was not present, and an image either was or was not face up on that shelf, waiting in the particular stillness of something built to be found. Of those 2,060 enrolled cardiac arrest events, 330 patients survived to be eligible for follow-up interview. The survival rate that number represents, approximately 16%, is consistent with published population-level cardiac arrest survival statistics for the period. Cardiac arrest survival, even in well-resourced hospital settings with experienced resuscitation teams, is not a certainty. The clinical interventions available significantly improve the odds, and the odds inside a hospital are meaningfully better than outside one, but the passage from cardiac arrest to recovery remains a narrow one. The figure of 330 survivors, set against the 2,060 enrolled events, is a way of holding that narrowness in a single arithmetic comparison. What that comparison also holds, if it is turned over and read from the other direction, is the number of patients who did not survive to be interviewed. 1,730 people across 15 hospitals. Over the years the study was active, did not come back from the cardiac arrest that enrolled them in the study. The research record contains their events, the clinical documentation of their resuscitations, the notation of when resuscitation efforts ceased, the case reference number that marked them in the enrollment log. They are not subjects with interview data. They are cases with clinical records and no follow-up column to fill in. The study was not designed to investigate what happened to them beyond the boundary of biological death. No study could be. It was designed to investigate the reports of those who came back. The 1,730 who did not come back are, in the evidentiary record of the AWARE study, a silence. In resuscitation medicine, the 10 to 20 second timeline for cortical electrical flattening after cardiac arrest onset is a number that comes from controlled physiological observation, from studies in which patients undergoing procedures expected to cause brief cardiac arrest had electroencephalographic monitoring in place before, during, and after the event, allowing researchers to record the exact moment that measurable electrical activity ceased. The number is well established and has been replicated across multiple investigations. It describes what happens to one measurable correlate of consciousness in a clearly defined and documented physiological situation. What it does not describe is what subjective experience, if any, accompanies that flattening, or what occurs in the patient's own phenomenology during the extended interval of cardiac arrest before restoration of circulation. The EEG line is still what that stillness means from the inside, if it means anything at all, is what the study was trying to find a way to ask. The question is not easy to hold as a purely abstract one, which is perhaps why researchers who approach it tend to accumulate large and careful methodologies. The 15 hospitals, the 2,060 enrolled events, the standardized protocols, the ceiling shelves, the peer review. The methodology is a way of taking the question seriously in the only language available to empirical science. The question cannot be approached directly. It can only be approached from outside through the reports of people who have been near the boundary and returned, checked against the independently verifiable details of the clinical environment. That is the limit of what the methodology can reach. The WARE study was designed to reach as far inside that limit as a prospective controlled clinical investigation could. The follow-up interview process was itself a methodological challenge. Cardiac arrest survivors, in the days and weeks following their events, are often cognitively impaired. The hypoxic injury that can accompany even a successfully resuscitated cardiac arrest may affect memory, concentration, and the ability to retrieve and organize information. Some survivors are too unwell for interview at the time of initial contact. Some are discharged before a researcher can reach them. Some are reluctant to describe unusual experiences in a clinical setting, uncertain how such descriptions will be received by the medical staff whose care they are still receiving. The AWARE study's interview protocol was designed to account for as many of these challenges as possible, using a structured assessment tool, timing the interview carefully relative to the patient's clinical condition, and approaching the subject matter in language that made clear the researchers were not evaluating the patient's mental health, but documenting their experience. The effort was substantial. The compliance with full interview completion was partial. Of the 330 eligible survivors, the number who completed the full structured assessment was 140. Each of those 140 completed assessments is a data point the study was built to generate. The cardiac arrest bay itself, considered as a room, has a particular quality in the hours when it is not in active use. The equipment is in its place. The crash cart stands where it stands. The monitor at the head of the bed is either off or in a standby state. The ceiling is where it always is, close enough to the bed in most hospital resuscitation bays that the distance is not large, though from the bed it appears simply as the upper boundary of the room. The shelf in hospitals where the installation had been completed and maintained correctly sat at ceiling height with its face turned upward. The image on the shelf was visible from above as a clear and high contrast shape. From the level of the bed, the shelf was a bracket and a board and a surface that held nothing you could see. The room was ordinary. The room was waiting. The 15 participating hospitals were distributed across institutions in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Austria, each with its own patient population, its own resuscitation team composition, its own ward architecture, and its own local logistical challenges in maintaining the study's experimental installations. The diversity of sites was a strength of the study's design, a finding that held consistently across multiple institutions in multiple countries would be harder to dismiss as a localized artifact than a finding from a single site. It was also a source of ongoing operational difficulty. Hospitals are not stable research environments. Staff turnover, wards are reorganized, equipment is moved, renovations change the rooms. The ceiling shelf in a cardiac arrest bay that was correctly installed and correctly maintained in January might, by August, be displaced, covered by a new piece of equipment, or no longer present. The study's research coordinators worked to monitor and correct these situations, but the challenge was persistent throughout the study period, and the published findings acknowledged it directly. The result of that persistent challenge was that, across the entire study, ceiling targets were successfully installed and maintained in only approximately 1/3 of the designated cardiac arrest zones. The majority of the 2,060 enrolled events, more than half by a significant margin, took place in rooms where no overhead target was present. For those events, the primary perceptual test the study was designed to administer could not have been performed. regardless of what the patient experienced or reported. The test required a target. Without a target, the test had no object. The study enrolled the event, interviewed the survivor if the survivor was eligible, and collected whatever experiential data the survivor provided. But the central visual perception hypothesis, the question of whether a patient could identify the image on the ceiling shelf from an elevated out-of-body perspective, could only theoretically have been answered in the minority of rooms where a shelf was present and a target was face up on it. That constraint is not a design failure in the straightforward sense. The study's designers knew that maintaining target installations across 15 hospitals over several years would be operationally difficult, and they built protocols intended to manage it. But the constraint meant that the study's evidentiary base for its central hypothesis was substantially narrower than the enrollment numbers suggest. 2,060 events enrolled. The number of events that occurred in rooms with functioning targets was considerably smaller. Within that smaller number, the number of patients who survived and reported an out-of-body experience was smaller still. The study's central question was always operating within a set of nested constraints that reduced the pool of potentially decisive events at each level. This is the arithmetic of a difficult research program in a domain where the phenomenon under study, if it occurs at all, occurs at its own frequency and in its own circumstances, without regard for whether the ceiling shelf happened to be correctly installed that week. The study could not schedule cardiac arrests for rooms with targets. It could not ensure that patients who had out-of-body experiences would have them in the right rooms. It could only build the test, maintain it as well as possible, enroll the events as they came, and wait for an alignment that over the study period produced a specific and limited evidentiary record. That record is what the published paper contains. It is precise about what it found, and precise about the conditions under which it found it, and the precision includes a clear account of the operational constraints that shaped what the record could contain. The researchers who worked on the AWARE study, the coordinators at participating institutions, the staff conducting follow-up interviews, the team at the coordinating center maintaining the protocol and reviewing the incoming data were working within the methodological conventions of clinical research, applying to an unusual scientific question the same rigor they would apply to a trial of a new resuscitation drug or a study of post-cardiac arrest neurological outcomes. The documentation is formal. The assessments are standardized. The clinical backdrop against which patient reports are evaluated is specified in detail in the published paper. The methodology earns its place in the journal Resuscitation, a publication of the European Resuscitation Council, whose content is, ordinarily, concerned with questions like the comparative effectiveness of different compression depths or the optimal timing of adrenaline administration in shockable versus non-shockable rhythms. The AWARE study was, by the standards of that journal's usual content, an unusual entry. It was asking whether patients who had been clinically dead retained any perceptual access to their environment, and it was asking this in the formal language of prospective clinical research, with ethics committee approvals and pre-specified endpoints and a peer-reviewed methods section. The journal published it. The flat line on the EEG, held as an image rather than a number, is a line that runs from one point to another across the width of the paper. The line before it is irregular, peaks and troughs, rhythmic but not simple, the complex oscillatory signature of a brain in ordinary operation. The flat line after cardiac arrest onset is simpler. It is the absence of those oscillations rendered as a continuous horizontal mark. In the studies that documented the timeline, 10 to 20 seconds that transition from complex to flat was recorded with enough precision that the exact second of flattening could be identified and measured against the exact second of the cardiac event. The flat line itself runs for as long as the cardiac arrest continues, which in a resuscitation scenario means for as long as it takes the team to restore circulation, or until the decision is made that the resuscitation will not succeed. That interval can be minutes, it can be longer. Whatever the patients later reported experiencing during their cardiac arrests, and the AWARE study's follow-up interviews collected a range of reported experiences across the 140 who completed the full assessment. They reported it against the backdrop of that line being flat on the paper. The timeline is not in dispute. The EAG data from cardiac arrest physiology is consistent across multiple research groups over several decades. What remains unresolved is the relationship between the flat line and the reported experience. Whether the report is a memory of something that occurred before the line flattened, or after it began to recover, or during the interval when no measurable cortical electrical activity was present, and whether the concept of perception, as it is normally understood, applies inside any of those windows at all. The AWARE study was not designed to resolve that question from first principles. It was designed to test a specific observable implication of one class of claims about what occurs during that interval. The claim that some patients, during cardiac arrest, have genuine perceptual access to their physical environment from a perspective elevated above their own body. If that claim is accurate, patients in rooms with ceiling targets should at some rate above chance be able to identify what image is on the shelf. The study built the test, the study ran it, the published findings describe, with careful precision, what the test produced. The 330 survivors, eligible for interview, represent in the abstract a group of people who each passed through the window of clinical death and came back through the other side. Their resuscitations followed standardized advanced cardiac life support protocols. Their cardiac arrests were documented. Their survival was documented. Their follow-up interviews for the 140 who completed the full assessment were conducted using structured instruments designed to capture and classify whatever experiential content they reported. They were not selected for interview because they reported unusual experiences. They were eligible for interview because they survived. The interview was offered to all of them and completed by fewer than half. The ones who completed the interview answered questions about whether they were aware of anything during their resuscitation, about the specific content of any awareness they recalled, about the perceptual quality and emotional character of what they reported. The structured instrument gave researchers a way to record and compare those reports across individuals and across sites. What the interviews found, the distribution of reported experiences, the proportion who met the threshold for a full near-death experience on a standardized scale, the single case whose account could be checked against independently verifiable clinical details, is contained in the published paper. The paper is measured in its conclusions, careful about what the data establishes and what it does not, and specific about the operational constraints that shaped the evidentiary record it was working from. A clinical investigation that runs across 15 hospitals on 2 continents, enrolling more than 2,000 cardiac arrest events over several years, and publishes its findings in a peer-reviewed resuscitation journal, produces a document that exists in the medical literature as a permanent record of a careful attempt to ask a precise scientific question about a phenomenon that most medical literature does not ask about at all. The AWARE study, whatever one makes of its findings, is that kind of document. It is specific. It is methodologically transparent. It acknowledges its limitations in the same formal language with which it reports its results. It is, in the Register of Clinical Research, a serious piece of work applied to a question that sits at the outer edge of what clinical research is ordinarily set up to address. The question itself: what, if anything, a person experiences during cardiac arrest, when measurable cortical electrical activity has ceased and the clinical definition of death has been met, is not new. It has been asked by philosophers in the language of consciousness and the self, by theologians in the language of the soul, by survivors in the language of private and sometimes difficult personal testimony. The AWARE study asked it in the language of prospective clinical research, with ceiling shelves and structured interview instruments and multi-site ethics approvals. That language does not resolve the question. No available language resolves it. But the AWARE study's version of the asking is available in the journal Resuscitation, published in October 2014, in dense and careful columns of peer-reviewed text, and it will remain there as long as the archive holds. The 330 survivors, the 140 interviews, the particular arithmetic of who came back and who, when asked, could describe something that had happened while their heart was stopped and their brain's electrical signature was flat and still. That arithmetic does not close the question. It describes the population of people in whom the question had the possibility of being addressed at all. The people who were on the recoverable side of the boundary, who had a resuscitation team working on them in a room, and who survived to sit in a follow-up interview room some days later with a researcher and a structured questionnaire and enough clarity to attempt a description of what they remembered. That passage from the cardiac arrest bay to the interview chair is narrow in every direction, and what arrived at the interview chair in the accounts of 140 people who had been in that bay was what the AWARE study was built to receive. A structured questionnaire lay on the table between them. It had been printed on standard clinical paper, the font small and even, the questions arranged in a sequence designed to move gradually from the general to the specific, from awareness of the environment to awareness of one's own body, to finally the particular character of anything that could not be easily placed. The researcher held a pen. The survivor sat across from her in a room with a window, and outside the window, the afternoon was entirely ordinary, the kind of afternoon that continues without reference to what has happened inside hospitals on previous days. The interview had been scheduled for a time when the patient was stable enough to speak, recovered enough to concentrate, and close enough to the event that the memory had not yet fully softened into something else. This was how the AWARE study gathered what it called patient-reported experiential content. Not through ward-round conversations, not through overheard remarks, but through a formal structured process. A researcher, a form, a quiet room, a survivor who had agreed to be asked. The questionnaire moved through its sequence with the particular patience of something designed to collect data without inadvertently shaping what it collected. Feelings of peace, sounds from the room, visual impressions, any sense of movement, any impression of position in space relative to the body on the bed. The questions did not lead. They arrived one at a time, holding open a space into which someone could speak or into which they could remain quiet, and both were acceptable outcomes. Both were recorded. Across the study's full enrollment, 330 patients survived cardiac arrest and were considered eligible for this kind of interview. Of those, 140 completed the full structured assessment. The gap between 330 and 140 was itself a finding of a kind. Interview fatigue, cognitive impairment in the aftermath of resuscitation, some patients too unwell at follow-up, others simply declining. The number who completed the process was smaller than the number who could theoretically have contributed to it, and the researchers noted this openly. Among the 140 who completed the assessment, 55, approximately 39%, reported some form of conscious awareness or experiential content occurring during or around the period of their resuscitation. Not all of these were detailed, not all of them were coherent. Some were fragments, an impression of light, a feeling of calm without a specific associated memory, a sense of being above something without any accompanying visual recollection. Others were longer, more structured, and more specific, describing rooms and sounds and the movements of people. The range was wide. The experiences within this range had a quality that made them difficult to place inside a simple interpretive framework. A feeling of peace during cardiac arrest might be explained by several mechanisms: neurochemical, hypoxic, the brain's own responses to profound physiological stress. An impression of a deceased relative might be classified as a grief-adjacent hallucination, a function of how memory reorganizes itself under extreme duress. These explanations are plausible. They are not complete, but they are plausible, and they account for a portion of what the surviving patients reported. What they cannot account for as easily is specific, accurate, externally verifiable information about the physical environment, information that a patient lying unconscious on a hospital bed with no blood pumping through their brain would not conventionally be expected to possess. The AWARE study enrolled 2,060 cardiac arrest events across its participating hospitals. Of the survivors, of the 140 interviewed, of the 55 who reported awareness during resuscitation, one case carried a quality, the others did not. Parnia's team designated this case in the published literature as Patient 57. The designation was a function of research protocol, a number within an enrolled sequence, but the number has a particular quality in the context of this research. A 57-year-old man recorded as case number 57 from Southampton, England, a social worker by profession. A person who had been in cardiac arrest, had been resuscitated, had survived, and had agreed, some days later, to sit in a room with a researcher and a structured questionnaire and describe as carefully as he could what he remembered. What patient 57 reported began with movement. He described rising, not metaphorically, not in the language of dreaming, but in the specific physical grammar of vertical displacement, and then looking downward. Below him, he reported, was the resuscitation room. He described the layout of the space. He described the position of the bed, and the position of the bed relative to the door, and the position of the crash cart near the bed. He described the personnel moving in the room, not generically, not as a blurred impression of figures, but in terms of specific actions he attributed to specific positions in the room. He said he had heard the automated external defibrillator speak. An AED in a hospital resuscitation bay is a machine with a voice. It issues verbal instructions to the staff using it, standardized prompts delivered in a recorded voice that carries clearly across the noise of a resuscitation in progress. Patient 57 reported hearing it. He reported that the voice gave instructions to the people in the room, which is what AED voice prompts do, and the AED had in fact been in use during his resuscitation. He also reported something more specific than this. A nurse, he said, had climbed up onto something, had stepped up, had elevated herself relative to the floor, and this action had been taken at the bedside, in the room, during the resuscitation. The context for this kind of action in a resuscitation setting is not obscure. When compressions are performed on a patient lying in a hospital bed, the height of the bed relative to the person performing compressions can affect the force and angle of pressure applied. Climbing onto a surface, a chair, a step, the edge of the bed frame, allows a nurse or technician to apply downward force more effectively. It is a practical adaptation. It is not, however, something that a patient, lying on the bed with blood no longer circulating through their brain, would be expected to observe. The action takes place above the patient's head. It takes place in the visual field, available to someone standing or elevated in the room, not to someone horizontal and unconscious on the bed. The researchers followed patient 57's account carefully. They took the items he had described, the nurse's movement, the AED's vocal instructions, the specific arrangement of the room, and they went to the staff who had been present during the resuscitation. They asked what had happened. They asked about position and movement and the use of equipment. The staff confirmed that a nurse had climbed onto a surface during the resuscitation in order to improve the effectiveness of chest compressions. They confirmed that an automated external defibrillator had been in use and had issued verbal instructions to the team. These confirmations were not based on what patient 57 had said. They were gathered independently through staff testimony and through a review of the clinical record from the resuscitation itself. The details matched in the ways that mattered: specific actions, specific equipment, in the specific room, during the specific event. The word used in the published paper for this kind of corroboration is careful. Parnia's language throughout the discussion of patient 57 moves within a precise range. Words like consistent, corroborated, and verified carry their weight without exceeding it, which is the right register for a finding of this kind in a scientific document. Consistent does not mean confirmed. Corroborated does not mean explained. The account patient 57 gave was consistent with what the staff independently described. The details that could be checked were checked, and they held. What the paper does not claim is that this corroboration establishes the reality of out-of-body perception in any definitive sense. The paper states what it can state. The finding sits in its own carefully bounded space, and the paper builds that boundary with the same care it used to build the experimental design. The space in which patient 57's account sits is also defined by something that was not present. Parnia's team confirmed, when they reviewed the operational records for the study at the relevant hospital site, that the cardiac arrest bay in which patient 57's resuscitation had taken place was not one of the rooms where a ceiling-mounted target shelf had been installed. The shelf, the elevated surface, the upward-facing image, the piece of the experimental apparatus designed to turn the claim of out-of-body perception into a falsifiable test, was not in that room. The most detailed, most specifically verifiable, most carefully corroborated patient account in the entire study arose in precisely the room where the mechanism for testing it was absent. This is not an accusation. It is not a failure of individual researchers. The installation of ceiling targets across 15 hospitals over multiple years was a genuine operational challenge, one the published paper addressed directly. Staff turnover moved the targets. Ward reorganizations displaced them. Equipment repositioning covered them. Routine maintenance occasionally resulted in targets being removed and not replaced. The installation record across the study showed that targets had been successfully placed and maintained in approximately 1/3 of the designated cardiac arrest zones, meaning that in the majority of rooms where a cardiac arrest might occur within the study's parameters, there was no image waiting on a ceiling shelf. When patient 57's resuscitation happened in an untargeted room, the study's geometry produced an outcome that could not be a positive result for the primary hypothesis however rich the account that emerged from it. There is a particular quality to this coincidence, not dramatic, not conspiratorial, simply a feature of the gap between the ambition of an experimental design and the physical complexity of maintaining that design inside working hospitals across years and continents. The study was designed to test whether a patient reporting out-of-body perception could identify a specific image they should not have been able to see. The case that came closest to offering a testable account arose in a room with no image to identify. The question the study was built to ask remained, at this point in its data, unanswered, not because no patient reported the relevant kind of experience, but because the patient who did so happened to be resuscitated in the wrong room. The follow-up interview with patient 57 had included something else. Beyond the account of what he reported observing, the room, the nurse's movement, the AED's voice, he had also described a quality of experience during the period when his heart had stopped. Not frightening, not painful. Something he described as a state of calm awareness, a condition of being present without distress, observing without involvement in the activity below him. He was not a doctor. He was a social worker, someone professionally attuned to experience and language, someone accustomed to listening carefully to other people's accounts and finding their internal logic. When he described his own account to the researcher across the table, he did so with what the follow-up report characterized as clarity, a coherent sequence of perceptions, consistently described, not contradicted by subsequent questioning. The 39% of interviewed survivors who reported some form of conscious awareness during resuscitation did not all describe experiences of this kind. The range was wide and the specificity was variable. Some reported sounds, voices, the rhythm of compressions, mechanical sounds from the room without any accompanying visual content. Some reported visual impressions, light, movement, shapes, without the ordered perspective of a specific vantage point. Some reported experiences that placed them outside the hospital entirely, in environments that bore no relationship to the resuscitation bay, gardens, corridors, rooms from earlier in their lives, presences that had no physical form, but were identified as people they had known who were no longer living. These accounts were gathered with the same structured methodology. They were scored on the same assessment tool. They were held within the same careful interpretive frame. What distinguished patient 57's account was not its emotional character. Many survivors described experiences of comparable peace or significance, but its spatial specificity and its verifiability. He described actions in a room that could be checked. He described equipment in a room that could be confirmed. He described a perspective from above looking downward that corresponded to the exact vantage point the study's target system had been designed to test. His account was not merely about the quality of being near death. It was about the geometry of a room, and the geometry matched. The published paper placed patient 57's account in a specific section of the findings discussion, adjacent to and clearly distinguished from the broader statistical results. The language acknowledged the partial corroboration while also noting the absence of the target installation. These two facts sat side by side on the page without one canceling the other. The account was real in the sense that the patient had given it and the staff had confirmed what could be confirmed. The test was incomplete in the sense that the mechanism designed to either confirm or disprove the core hypothesis had not been present in that room. Neither of these facts erased the other. They remained together in their qualified state inside the peer-reviewed record of a large and seriously conducted study. The structured interview form used with patient 57 survives as a document. It is not publicly available in full, but its contents have been described in the published literature and in Parnia's subsequent accounts of the study. The fields filled in during that follow-up interview, the account of the room's layout, the nurse climbing onto the surface, the AED's voice, were checked against the clinical record and the staff testimony with the same procedure used for any clinical research verification. The checking was done carefully. The results were reported carefully. The caution in the language was not defensive. It was the appropriate register for a finding that could not fully resolve itself. Patient 57's resuscitation had lasted approximately 3 minutes. That duration was recorded in the clinical notes from the event. 3 minutes is a relatively long cardiac arrest for a survivor. The probability of neurological recovery declines substantially with each minute of sustained circulatory arrest, and the clinical outcome for a patient resuscitated after 3 minutes without cerebral circulation is not trivially good. The fact that patient 57 survived with the cognitive clarity to give a structured, coherent, and consistently described account several days later was itself a notable clinical detail, independent of the content of the account. His brain had been without effective circulation for 3 minutes. He was speaking coherently and in detail about what he reported perceiving during those 3 minutes. The cognitive model of experience during cardiac arrest does not support the production of new, accurate, externally verifiable perceptual information during the period of circulatory arrest. The electroencephalographic record from cardiac arrest studies shows measurable cortical activity flattening within approximately 10 to 20 seconds of arrest onset, and it remains flat, or shows only the grossly disorganized activity associated with severe cerebral hypoxia until circulation is restored. What patient 57 described was not a vague impression or a loosely organized feeling. It was a specific spatial account with specific actors performing specific actions in a specific room. The standard cognitive model has no straightforward mechanism for producing that kind of output from a brain without blood flow. That does not mean no mechanism exists. It means no satisfactory mechanism has been proposed that accounts for the full character of the account as it was reported and as it was corroborated. There is a set of alternative explanations that serious researchers on this topic have put forward, and they deserve to be held honestly alongside the account. One involves the peri-arrest period, the seconds before circulatory arrest becomes complete, when the brain is losing blood flow but has not yet fully ceased organized activity. A patient whose awareness was consolidated in this narrow window might encode environmental information from a partially functional sensory state before the EEG flatline, and then retrieve that information later with a memory architecture that placed it at a different temporal point, inside rather than before the full arrest. This is a plausible account. It does not resolve the spatial perspective. A patient lying horizontal in a bed in the peri-arrest period is not looking down from near the ceiling. The perspective cannot easily be produced by residual awareness in a supine, rapidly losing consciousness body. Another explanation involves auditory information gathered during the resuscitation itself. In a state of unresponsive but not entirely absent hearing, auditory processing is among the last functions to diminish during unconsciousness, and there is some clinical evidence that patients under anesthesia retain more auditory encoding than was previously assumed. Patient 57 reported hearing the AED's verbal instructions, which could fall within this account. The nurse's movement, however, was described visually and spatially, a body seen climbing from a perspective looking downward, and this element of the report does not resolve as easily into residual auditory encoding. Visual spatial information gathered from a position the patient was not in, with eyes closed and no blood flowing, is harder to account for through the peri-arrest hearing hypothesis than the auditory elements of the same account. The AWARE study was not designed to resolve this debate. It was designed to test one specific aspect of it: whether a patient reporting an out-of-body perspective during cardiac arrest could identify a specific image visible only from that perspective. Patient 57 did not have access to that test because the test was not in his room. What he contributed instead was a detailed, spatially specific account that was partially corroborated through independent testimony, the kind of account that the target image system was designed to produce definitive evidence about if it ever occurred in a room where the system was installed and functioning. The study generated the kind of case it was built around. It generated it in the wrong room. The 55 survivors who reported awareness of any kind included cases that ranged across the full phenomenological spectrum the AWARE researchers had anticipated. Several reported visual perceptions of the room during the period of resuscitation, but without the verifiable spatial specificity of patient 57's account. These reports, a nurse moving, a light overhead, a sense of the room's dimensions, could not be cross-checked against independently confirmed staff observations in the same way, either because the reported details were too general to verify, or because the clinical record from the event did not provide the necessary granularity. The accuracy of these reports therefore remained in a different evidentiary category from patient 57-2's. A smaller number of survivors reported experiences that did not engage with the physical hospital room at all. They described being in other places, settings that felt peaceful, that contained people or presences they recognized, that did not correspond to any observable feature of the resuscitation bay. These reports are outside the scope of what the target image system was built to test. A patient who reports standing in a garden with a deceased parent during cardiac arrest has given an account the AWARE methodology cannot evaluate, because there is no external reference point against which to check the report's accuracy. The study's experimental design was constructed specifically around the subset of reports involving accurate physical perception of the resuscitation environment, the kind of account where independent verification is, in principle, possible. Most of what the survivors described fell outside that subset. The structured questionnaire that sat on the table during patient 57's interview was designed to move towards specificity gradually, gently, without pushing the person being interviewed toward any particular kind of account. The interview protocol acknowledged that survivors of cardiac arrest are in a particular psychological position. They have experienced something serious. They may carry cognitive effects from the event itself, and they may have complex feelings about what they report, remembering from it. Some survivors, the researchers noted in the published paper, were reluctant to disclose unusual experiences in a clinical setting, concerned that they would be disbelieved or that their account would reflect badly on them in some way. The protocol was designed to create enough safety that people could speak honestly about whatever they had and had not experienced. Patient 57 spoke clearly. His account did not waver when it was questioned in subsequent follow-up. He described what he described consistently across the interval between the initial interview and the later cross-checking. The ward in Southampton, where patient 57 had been resuscitated, was a working NHS hospital unit. It was not a research space. It was a place where sick people arrived and were treated, where resuscitation teams responded to cardiac arrest with the systematic calm of trained professionals, where the clinical reality of a hospital day continued without reference to the research protocol that had been layered over it. The AWARE study existed inside ordinary clinical environments, not alongside them in some separate controlled space, but within them, dependent on them for its data, constrained by all the operational pressures and practical disruptions that working hospitals produce. Patient 57's experience, whatever its nature, happened within that ordinary clinical world. The researcher who interviewed patient 57 in the follow-up room would have moved through the questionnaires' structured sequence without knowing yet what the staff corroboration would eventually show. The interview was the first layer of the data, and the cross-checking came later. During the interview itself, the account was simply an account, a survivor's description of what he reported experiencing, gathered through an instrument designed to record it accurately. The discovery that the nurse had climbed onto the surface, that the AED had spoken in the room, came afterward. The account was assembled into something partially corroborated by a process that took time, and that involved other people, and that produced a finding that the researchers then spent time determining how to describe accurately in the language of a peer-reviewed paper. The published paper described it as the only case in the study in which out-of-body experiences could be said to have been partially corroborated by the independent observations of clinical staff. That sentence carries its qualification explicitly, partially corroborated, said to have been. It does not reach beyond what the verification established. It does not retreat from what the verification showed. It holds the finding in its precise qualified form, on the page, in a clinical journal that does not customarily publish reports of this kind. Among the formal findings of a study that had enrolled 2,060 cardiac arrest events across 15 hospitals and 2 continents, and 3 years of careful, difficult, logistically demanding research. Parnia's name appears at the top of the published paper as principal investigator. His name also appears in the acknowledgments of the study's limitations, which he listed methodically: the target installation problems, the variable completion rate for follow-up interviews, the small number of fully corroborable cases, the operational gap between the scale of the study's ambition and the practical reality of running a multi-site prospective investigation inside working hospitals. He did not characterize patient 57's case as confirmation of anything. He characterized it as significant enough to warrant the continuation of the research, as evidence that the question was worth continuing to ask in a more operationally robust framework. The finding was not an answer. It was a reason to keep designing better questions. The interview room where patient 57 spoke with the AWARE researcher was quiet and unremarkable. The window would have shown an ordinary Southampton afternoon. The form on the table would have been filled in steadily, item by item, as the survivor across from the researcher described what he had seen and heard from a position near the ceiling of a room in which his heart had stopped. Outside the room, the hospital continued. Elsewhere in the building, other patients were being treated. Other resuscitations were preparing to be conducted. Other research subjects were going about their recoveries. The afternoon was ordinary in all the ways that afternoons in hospitals are ordinary. What patient 57 was saying in that room was not ordinary, or not easy to place inside ordinary categories. It was specific, and it was consistent, and when it was checked against the staff who had been in the room with him, the details held. The ceiling of the resuscitation room in Southampton that housed patient 57's arrest was bare. No shelf had been mounted there. No image waited face up above the fluorescent panels, out of sight from every standing angle in the room. The room was simply a room, a place where cardiac arrests were treated, where resuscitation teams worked, where the standard clinical protocol was followed. The experimental apparatus had not reached that room in time, or at all. Whatever patient 57 had been near the ceiling of her being, whatever it was that had given him the downward view of the nurse climbing, the voice of the AED, the spatial layout of a room he had been lying horizontal and unconscious in, it was in a room the study could not evaluate. The question arrived in the wrong room. The shelf that would have answered it was somewhere else, and what patient 57 saw, or reported seeing from above, remained exactly what it had always been, a careful, specific, partially confirmed account sitting in a peer-reviewed paper, unresolved and persisting quietly, the way the most careful findings tend to do. A researcher is seated at a small table in a follow-up room in one of the participating hospitals, the window beside them showing an ordinary afternoon, a car park, a line of bare trees, the particular flat light of a British winter. On the table between the researcher and the patient, there is a printed form. It is 2 pages long. It has 16 questions arranged in 4 groups, and beside each question there are 3 columns, numbered 0, 1, and 2. The form is the Grayson Near-Death Experience Scale. The pencil moves down the first column, and the first interview of the day begins. Bruce Grayson developed this instrument in 1983, at a time when near-death experience research had accumulated enough accounts to make systematic comparison worthwhile, but lacked a standardized means of doing it. The scale he produced was built on 4 subscales: cognitive, affective, paranormal, and transcendental, each capturing a different dimension of what survivors had described across the existing literature. A score of 7 or above placed an account in the category the scale defined as a full near-death experience. A score below that threshold registered the account without classifying it as a complete experiential event. The scale was precise without being reductive. It gave researchers a shared language for a body of reported experience that had previously been held together primarily by its own recurring patterns, and it allowed the AWARE study's findings to be set beside earlier work, including Pim van Lommel's 2001 investigation, published in The Lancet, and read within a continuous evidentiary record rather than in isolation. The pencil continues down the columns. The patient describes what they remember. The researcher marks the score. Outside the window, the light is already beginning to go, the sky settling toward gray, the afternoon moving forward in the way afternoons move. In hospitals, not urgently, not quite still. Approximately 9% of the interviewed survivors in the AWARE study scored 7 or above on the Grayson scale, meeting the threshold for classification as a full near-death experience. Sam Parnia noted in the published paper that this figure likely represented an undercount. Cognitive impairment from the resuscitation event itself, fatigue in the days and weeks following discharge, and a reluctance among some survivors to describe unusual experiences within a clinical setting. All of these factors, he acknowledged, would tend to compress reported rates below the actual incidence. The number on the page was a floor, not a ceiling. What it measured was not all of what had happened. It was only what had been disclosed in the particular conditions of a follow-up interview to a researcher holding a pencil above a scoring column in a room with a window overlooking a car park. The Grayson scale assessment completed, the researcher closed the form and wrote the score in the margin. The survivor across the table was quiet for a moment. Some things are easier to describe in the clinical language of a questionnaire, and some things are not. The scale did what it could with both kinds. In the years since the AWARE study was published, the research has continued to attract comment from researchers working inside and outside the field of resuscitation science, and the commentary has not been uniform. Susan Blackmore, a psychologist whose 1993 book, Dying to Live, presented a physiological and psychological account of near-death experiences, has argued in published commentary that out-of-body target testing research faces fundamental interpretive difficulties that no positive result could cleanly resolve. Her position is not that the research is poorly designed. Her position is that the problem the research is designed to solve is harder than its design can fully address. Even if a patient were to correctly identify an image on a ceiling-mounted shelf, she has argued, numerous pathways to accurate description exist that do not require genuine out-of-body visual perception. Overheard conversations between staff, prior familiarity with hospital environments, the cognitive and neurological effects of cerebral hypoxia, producing unusual but physiologically grounded perceptual states. A correct identification, in other words, would be a meaningful finding. It would not by itself be an unambiguous one. Her 1993 book lies open on a researcher's desk beside a printout of the Aware paper, the two documents sitting in the particular quiet of an academic argument conducted across publications and years without urgency and without a final verdict. The argument is not hostile. It is the ordinary productive tension of a field working out what its evidence can and cannot bear. Parnia's published response to these concerns was measured. He acknowledged the interpretive difficulties. He agreed that a single positive identification would not constitute definitive proof. What the study was designed to do, he noted, was not produce a single decisive result, but accumulate a controlled evidentiary record to establish, through prospective design and independently verified corroboration, whether the category of veridical out-of-body perception had any evidentiary foundation at all, or whether it resided entirely in the territory of anecdote and unfalsifiable report. The study asked whether the phenomenon could be detected under controlled conditions. It did not claim, even in its most careful positive findings, to have explained what the phenomenon was. Those are two different questions, and they were held as two different questions throughout the published paper. The printout of the Aware paper sits beside the open Blackmore book. Neither document has resolved what the other raised. Both remain in print. The argument continues without either side requiring the other to stop. The practical challenge of the original study's design, the installation and maintenance of ceiling-mounted image shelves across 15 hospitals over several years, became the basis for the principal structural change in the study's successor. Aware 2 was launched as a direct response to what the first study had found difficult to control. The fixed printed images on physical shelving units were replaced with electronic tablets, each mounted near the ceiling of a designated cardiac arrest bay, and programmed to cycle through a sequence of randomized images. The rotation was automatic. The image displayed at any given moment was not known in advance to any member of the clinical team. It changed on a schedule set by the tablet's programming, cycling through its sequence without requiring anyone in the ward to remember to verify it, replace it, or ensure it had not been accidentally covered or removed. A tablet mounted near the ceiling of an Aware 2 cardiac arrest bay shows its current image toward the floor of the room, a bright, high-contrast shape facing downward into the space where a resuscitation team would work. The image changes, another shape replaces it. The tablet is running. No one in the room is aware of which image is currently displayed. The proximity detection system added in Aware 2 addressed the second major operational limitation of the original study, the difficulty of retrospectively confirming whether a resuscitation had actually occurred in a room where a target was present and functioning. In the first study, target presence had to be verified through ward coordinator checklists, a system vulnerable to staff turnover, ward reorganizations, and the ordinary disorder of a working hospital environment. In Aware 2, a sensor automatically logged whether a resuscitation event was occurring in a room where a tablet was active, creating a digital record that required no human confirmation and was not subject to the gaps and inconsistencies that had marked the first study's target verification records. If a patient subsequently reported an out-of-body experience during their resuscitation, the log would confirm or deny whether a target image had been present and active at the time. The question of whether the right test had been available for the right event could finally be answered with certainty from data the system had gathered without anyone needing to remember to gather it. A proximity sensor in an Aware 2 cardiac arrest bay records the time. The tablet above it records the image. Both devices are operating in a room where no one is currently paying them any attention. The room is empty. The ward outside is quiet. The logs are accumulating. Sam Parnia presented preliminary observations from Aware 2 at academic conferences in the years following its launch, describing an enrollment of cases, a continuing collection of patient interviews, and a body of tablet-logged proximity data. Some patients had again reported conscious awareness during resuscitation. The accounts, he noted, were consistent with the types of experience described in the original study. The careful conditional language of the conference presentations was the same language that had appeared in the 2014 paper, not because the findings were being withheld, but because the findings were still being gathered. As of early 2025, no peer-reviewed primary findings publication had been produced from Aware 2. The study was still running. A projected slide in a conference room at a resuscitation research symposium showed enrollment numbers, a row of figures representing cases, interviews, and tablet activations, the columns of data incomplete in the way that columns of data from an ongoing study are always incomplete. The audience of clinicians and researchers in the low light took notes in the margins of their programs. The figure at the lectern described the findings in careful, open language. The slide was replaced by the next one. The conference continued. There is a category of research whose value lies not in what it has found, but in the fact that it is still looking, and looking with the kind of precision that makes a finding, when it comes, worth examining. The Aware study belonged to that category. The research it produced was not a negative result in the ordinary sense of the phrase. It was a carefully documented partial result, a study that enrolled 2,060 cardiac arrest events, followed up 330 survivors, collected accounts from 140 of them, found one case in which an out-of-body account could be partially corroborated against independently verified clinical observations, and acknowledged honestly that the case in which those observations arose was the one case for which no overhead image had been installed. The result was not nothing. It was also not enough to close the question. It was, precisely, the kind of result that makes a successor study necessary. Aware 2 is that successor. Its design addresses the specific operational failures of the original. Its tablets cycle without human intervention. Its sensors log without human confirmation. Its records are accumulating in filing cabinets, in research offices in the participating hospitals, the folders growing thicker by the case, the most recent entries not yet reviewed. The filing cabinet in a research office at one of the participating hospitals is a standard gray metal 4-drawer unit, the kind found in administrative offices in hospitals all over the world. The third drawer is where the Aware 2 materials are kept. The drawer contains interview transcripts printed on white paper and placed in manila folders, Grayson scale assessments with the scoring columns filled in pencil, proximity sensor logs printed from the tablet system showing which rooms were active and when, and case reference numbers corresponding to each enrolled cardiac arrest event. The folders are arranged by date. The most recent folder is toward the front. It is not yet closed. The study has not found its central result. The central result the study was designed to produce would be a case in which a patient reported floating upward and looking down in a room where a tablet was active, and the patient's description of what they saw from above matched the image the tablet was displaying at the time, confirmed by the proximity log, and independently verified by the clinical record. That case has not been documented. What has been documented is every case that is not that case. The accounts that describe consciousness without a target present, the rooms where a target was active, but no one reported an experience, the events that fall on either side of the intersection the study was designed to detect. The particular intersection it needs has not yet occurred inside the study's enrollment, or has not yet been disclosed, or has not yet been verified through the full chain of corroboration the research protocol requires. The drawer holds what has been found. What has not been found is still in some sense also in the drawer, its absence recorded case by case as the study moves forward. Bruce Grayson's scale, with its 16 items and its 4 subscales, was built on the observation that certain experiences, wherever they originated, whatever their ultimate explanation, had a consistent internal structure. The cognitive items asked about time distortion, thought acceleration, and life review. The affective items asked about peace, joy, and unity. The paranormal items asked about altered perception, apparent extrasensory awareness, and precognitive vision. The transcendental items asked about encounters with other entities and the sense of arriving somewhere beyond ordinary experience. A survivor could score on any combination of these. A score of 7, distributed across the subscales in any configuration, placed the account in the category the scale recognized as a full near-death experience. The scale did not ask what had caused the experience. It asked only what had been experienced, and how much of it, and in which dimensions. In one of the aware 2 participating hospitals, a researcher is completing a Grayson scale assessment with a cardiac arrest survivor in a follow-up room that looks very much like the one used during the original study. A table, 2 chairs, a window, an afternoon that is moving forward at its own pace. The pencil moves down the columns. The numbers accumulate. The total at the bottom of the form will be whatever it is going to be. The researcher does not know the score before the assessment is complete, and the survivor does not know whether their experience will meet the classification threshold before the last item has been scored. This is how research of this kind works. It works slowly, case by case, form by form, in rooms like this one, in hospitals that are otherwise occupied with the ordinary demands of clinical medicine. The cases come in without announcement. The survivors are interviewed when they are recovered enough to speak. The scales are scored. The transcripts are filed. The proximity logs are printed and added to the folders. The drawer is never quite closed. Parnia's position throughout the aware study and its successor has been consistent. The question of whether consciousness can exist outside the brain during clinical death is a scientific question, not a metaphysical one, and scientific questions require scientific methods. The fact that the methods are difficult does not make the question less scientific. The fact that the question borders on the philosophical does not make it less empirical. What patients reported during cardiac arrest, under conditions that conventional neuroscience would predict should preclude any form of organized conscious experience, is a documented phenomenon whose explanation remains open. The documented phenomenon does not require an extraordinary explanation to be worth investigating. It requires a careful one. The AWARE study was that investigation. AWARE 2 is its continuation. The conference room at the Resuscitation Research Symposium is quiet now. The audience has dispersed. The projected slide is dark. The notes taken in the margins of programs are folded in jacket pockets and conference bags. The figures and observations carried out of the room into the ordinary world of clinical medicine, where they will be read again later, or filed, or discussed over coffee, or simply allowed to sit in the accumulating record of what this field of research has found and not yet found. Pim van Lommel's 2001 study in The Lancet, which the AWARE scale assessments were designed to be comparable with, had found that approximately 18% of cardiac arrest survivors it interviewed reported a near-death experience by its classification criteria. The AWARE study's 9%, Parnia acknowledged, was lower in ways that likely reflected the specific conditions of interview and disclosure in that study, rather than a genuine divergence in the incidence of the experience itself. 2 studies, 2 research teams, 2 sets of hospitals, 2 different countries, different clinical cultures, different distances between the patient and the follow-up interview, the same recurring structure of reported experience, the same questions about what that recurring structure meant. Van Lommel's paper is a published document in the clinical literature. So is the AWARE paper. They sit in the same archive, separated by 13 years, and the considerable difference between a Dutch prospective cohort study and a 15-hospital international investigation with ceiling-mounted image targets. They report similar things from different angles. Neither one resolves what both are describing. In a research office at a participating AWARE 2 hospital, late in the afternoon of an ordinary working day, a researcher closes the case file for the most recently completed interview. The Grayson scale form is in the folder. The transcript is in the folder. The proximity log is in the folder, confirming that the tablet in the relevant cardiac arrest bay had been active and cycling through its sequence at the time of the resuscitation. The patient's account has been recorded. The account has been scored. The score has been written in the margin. The folder has been closed and placed in the filing cabinet drawer. The researcher pushes the drawer in. It does not close all the way. There are enough folders in the drawer that the last one, the most recent one, holds the drawer slightly open. The gap is small. The light from the corridor reaches into the drawer and catches the edge of the most recent folder, the one not yet quite contained. The AWARE 2 study is still running. The tablets in the cardiac arrest bays are still cycling through their images. The proximity sensors are still logging. The follow-up interviews are still being conducted, case by case, in rooms that look like this one: a table, 2 chairs, a window showing an afternoon in whatever season the hospital is currently moving through. The cases are accumulating. The folders are accumulating. The drawer is not yet closed. There is a particular quality to research that has not yet found what it is looking for. A quality not of failure, but of continuation. The study persists in the same way that a question persists when it has been asked carefully enough and answered honestly enough to remain genuinely open. The Grayson scale assessments continue to be scored. The accounts continue to be filed. The tablets continue to cycle. The sensors continue to log. Somewhere in one of the participating hospitals, a cardiac arrest bay is currently set up with an active tablet mounted near the ceiling, its image facing downward toward a bed that is empty, the room clean and quiet between events. the tablet cycling through its sequence for an audience of no one. The image changes, another image replaces it. The room is still, the monitor on the wall is dark. The crash cart stands in its position beside the bed. The tablet cycles. The proximity sensor records the time. The ward outside is going about its ordinary evening. The sounds of a hospital at night, moving down the corridor and past the door of the cardiac arrest bay without entering. Footsteps, a cart, a distant conversation, a door. The filing cabinet in the research office holds the record of everything the study has found so far. The drawer is slightly open. The most recent folder is there, and the one before it, and the ones before that, going back through the months and years of enrollment to the first case logged in the first participating hospital on the first day the study began collecting. Each folder holds its transcript and its Grayson scale form and its proximity log and its case reference number, and each one represents a resuscitation and a survivor and a conversation in a follow-up room in a hospital somewhere in the network of institutions that agreed to participate in this long, careful, patient investigation. The investigation has not yet found the case it was designed to find. The drawer is slightly open. The tablet in the cardiac arrest bay is cycling. The question the study asked in its design, whether anyone, during cardiac arrest, looked down at an image no living person in the room could see, remains formally unanswered, not because the answer does not exist, but because the right case has not yet arrived inside the study's enrollment in the way the protocol requires. A patient who floated upward in a room where the tablet was active and described what they saw from the ceiling in terms the record could check against the log. That case may come. It may already be in the record and awaiting verification. It may be in a hospital that enrolled 2 months ago, or 6 months ago, or last week. It may be in a folder not yet filed, from an interview not yet completed, from a resuscitation that has not yet occurred. The study does not know when it is coming. The study is simply ready for it. The tablet cycling, the sensors logging, the follow-up researchers available, the Grayson scale forms printed and stacked on the shelf beside the interview table in every participating hospital's follow-up room. The afternoon light in the research office has flattened into evening. The researcher has gone. The desk is tidy. The filing cabinet drawer is slightly open. The most recent folder holding it, that small distance from closed. The corridor outside is quiet. The question that the aware study asks, in the specific and measurable form that a controlled scientific investigation requires, is the same question that the accounts themselves have always asked. The question underneath the accounts, the persistent structural question that recurs in the documented literature across decades and across different clinical populations, in different countries, and different researchers who came to the subject with different degrees of skepticism and left it, almost without exception, with a greater appreciation for how difficult the question is than they had arrived with.